Every year on the 1st of April, I like to have my own fun by turning my pedantic dial up to maximum and nitpicking something completely unnecessarily. Last year, I ranted about the problem of people using historical words incorrectly. And this year, well, I want to nitpick something else, something quite popular. It's a clip that's been floating around for years. You've probably seen it. In it, Matt Mercer, probably the most famous dungeon master in the world, is shown a comic strip depicting a single round of combat from D&D 5th edition, specifically the 2014 version. The game at hand point out every inaccuracy in this comic. When I first watched this, I was amused, but also bewildered, because famous inveterate dungeon masters Matt Mercer and Brennan Lee Mulligan are both involved in the production of this clip. Matt Mercer on camera, Brennan Lee Mulligan as the fact checker and question writer for Actually. And both of them seem to miss crucial bits of information that makes what we see on the show not everything wrong with this particular comic strip. And so for completion and pedantry's sake, today I want to dive deep into this 7-panel comic. I'm going to be nitpicking. I'm going to be pointing out every single thing that could possibly be wrong with it. And I hope that this forms an interesting or even educational resource in better understanding the rules of Dungeons & Dragons. But 2 caveats. First, I'm sure someone has done this somewhere, probably on Reddit, but I wanted to do my own version to partly test my own skills and partly dive deeper into the mechanics of this game that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And second, this is all in good fun. The players of the game had minutes at best to figure all of these things out. I had the benefit of multiple years since the clip was posted, and some preliminary research of my own. On the first panel, Matt Mercer spots everything that's wrong. Specifically, that the monsters depicted are a pit fiend and a lich, not a pit fiend and a demilich, as the text below states. A demilich is usually visually identified with a floating skull, generally with some sort of gem or precious thing in its eye sockets, to take the place, essentially, of a lich's phylactery. These magically imbued items in the skull itself act as a kind of soul trap for people who fight the demilich, so it can sustain itself, kind of passively, as opposed to the active lich phylactery preservation. Some people may think that the Goliath fighter having hair is another mistake, but Elbratha here is a female, as is actually clearly stated in the next panel, and while male Goliaths cannot grow it, female Goliaths do grow head hair, and often hold it and wear it in a braid. Our second panel shows our Goliath fighter charging the Pit Fiend, provoking an attack of opportunity. Pit Fiends, and indeed most creatures, have no ability to make attacks of opportunity when approached. Generally, these are restricted for creatures moving willingly Generally, these are restricted to creatures who move willingly, physically, out of an opponent's threatened range, not entering into said threatened range. Matt points this out, and also suggests that Elbratha couldn't use a reaction herself in this situation. The panel doesn't specify enough to be sure, but I would suggest that the reaction in question is a reaction taken on, say, being targeted with an attack or hit by an attack. These are legitimate triggers for reactions like Shield, or the interception fighting style from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which is available to fighters, and therefore may be available to Elbratha. The panel is still wrong, though, but Mercer's stated reason for it being wrong is incorrect. A reaction can be taken as a result of potentially being hit by an attack, causing that attack to miss. That is legitimate. Elbratha can't use a reaction here, even assuming that the Pit Fiend's attack of opportunity is in some way legitimate, because the dodge action is not a reaction. Dodge is never a reaction, and it wouldn't make too much sense mechanically anyway, as using dodge gives disadvantage to attacks that happen in the future until the start of your next turn. As a reaction to avoid an attack, probably we're looking at something akin to Silvery Barbs, which causes a reroll of the dice and therefore can cause an attack to miss as a reaction. Dodge here is the thing that really doesn't make sense. I'd therefore dock Mercer half a point here. The reaction indeed is not legitimate, but it's not because it's a reaction, it's because it's dodge, which he doesn't specify. Then, Matt Mercer makes an actual mistake. Funnily enough, it's framed in the edit as him catching a mistake made by the question writer, which I can assume is Brennan Lee Mulligan. But Mercer suggests that the silvered axe used by Elbratha wouldn't bypass the Pit Fiend's immunities to certain kinds of damage. First, it must be noted that Pit Fiends actually only resist bludgeoning, slashing and piercing damage anyway. So whether it's silver or not is immaterial because the comic depicts the Pit Fiend as being harmed, but it doesn't say how much it's harmed. Even a resisted strike could certainly deal some damage. That's not specified in the comic. But the bludgeoning, piercing and slashing damage resistance is conditional. And indeed, the Pit Fiend's conditional bludgeoning, piercing and slashing damage resistance can be bypassed with a silvered weapon. So the Pit Fiend is actually not immune to any axe's slashing damage, and in fact takes full damage specifically because it is a silvered axe. This really puts the integrity and knowledge of the internet's favourite dungeon masters in great jeopardy. Again, this exercise is supposed to be fun and educational, and this is my way of having fun. There's a massive difference between getting a rule wrong in the moment and getting a rule wrong with the ability to look things up. I am in no way upset or incensed at any of these people's minor inaccuracies in the rules of D&D. But I am just going to put a little counter in the corner. Next panel! Matt correctly notes that initiative should not be rolled here, but at the start of combat before anyone has taken a turn, but misses something else. He misses the fact that the Pit Fiend cannot cast Hold Monster and use its bite, claw, mace and tail attacks on the same turn. Multi-attack, as an action for the Pit Fiend, only allows for the use of the 4 melee attacks. It doesn't also include the casting of a spell, which in itself is another action. Assuming the Pit Fiend is not hasted, which rules actually say we shouldn't assume anything that isn't included in the text, it cannot use both a spell and its multi-attack action. Indeed, by the 5e 2014 rules, which is when this clip was created, even with haste, the Pit Fiend couldn't use a spell and its multi-attack feature because the attack that is available by being hasted only allows you to make a single attack. And you can't cast a spell at all using that hasted action. Matt goes on to correctly identify that Grumsh One-Eye is not a god of the Forge, but it is actually the Orcish patron god. That Fireball cannot be cast using a 2nd level spell slot because it's a 3rd level spell, and that it isn't available on the cleric spell list either, which he does correctly indicate. Indeed, even if Omerek were a cleric of the Forge and the Grumsh bit was just incorrect, he still wouldn't have Fireball on his spell list despite being, a cleric of the Forge domain. Or if he's a cleric of War or Tempest, which are Grumsh One-Eye's kind of main focuses, he still wouldn't have Fireball on his cleric list. The only cleric domain that has access to Fireball as part of their base domain spells is the Light Cleric, which Ormerek is not depicted as being. This is not counting other shenanigans like multi-classing or Wish or Divine Intervention, which would very much come into the realm of stuff that we don't need to worry about because it's not included. Mercer also correctly identifies that the Pit Fiend should be immune to the damage of a Fireball anyway, because Pit Fiends are immune to fire damage, and therefore the Pit Fiend should not be destroyed by this spell. Technically, something that should have possibly been included is that Omerek the Cleric started his turn within 20 feet of the Pit Fiend, as evidenced by the fact that the Pit Fiend attacked him with all of its 4 attacks, meaning that it must be at least within 5 feet, which is the range of the bite attack. We can also see how close Omerek is starting his turn to the Pit Fiend by the art as well. So really, So really, the cleric needed to make a saving throw against the Pit Fiend's fear aura before anything else happened on his turn. But seeing as his being frightened wouldn't have actually negatively impacted any of the actions he took, such as casting a spell, specifically Fireball, and, not moving, we can say that this is something that the panel or the artists or the writers chose to leave out because it didn't material affect any part of the combat, and therefore I'm not counting it as an exclusion. Alternatively, maybe Umarek succeeded on the fear save at some point in the last 24 hours, which would make him immune anyway. On the next panel, Matt is again correct that in 5e's 2014 rule set, drinking a potion is an action, unlike, ironically, in his home game. And as such, it can't be used alongside another action. But there is something really key that he misses. Benign transposition doesn't do anything close to what's described. I don't blame Mr. Mercer on this one. I had to look it up, because the School of Conjuration Wizard subclass is not a well-used one. Benign transposition teleports you 30 feet as an action, or allows you to swap places with a small or medium creature within 30 feet of you. There is no way to use benign transposition to cause another creature to be affected by a spell like invisibility. And if benign transposition were used on Una the Rogue, that would imply that the two characters swapped places, teleported to swap places. Nothing more. This completely made up text of benign transposition is something that was missed by the players in actually, although I imagine very intentionally included by the question setters. There are so many issues on the next panel that it's almost like it was intentionally designed to confound and frustrate anyone with a knowledge of 5th edition's rules. Mercer correctly identifies that invisibility has no bearing on how effective the Demilich's Howl attack would be. He's also correct in noting that the use of Vile Curse is suspect, noting that Vile Curse does not, in fact, require a Charisma saving throw, but as is later pointed out by Mike Trapp, it's a Wisdom saving throw instead. But his suggestion that, quote, you can only use legendary actions at the end of players' turns is technically wrong. Legendary actions can be used at the end of another creature's turn. So as long as the Demilich wasn't using these legendary actions after its own turn, which it seems to do, it could have theoretically used a legendary action after a Pit Fiend's turn, or any other creature in initiative, not necessarily a player turn. I think Matt Mercer can still have the point though here, because in most cases he is correct, and also I imagine he was probably trying to speed through this because it's quite a long round as a mini-game goes in a larger shoot, not wanting to waste production's time by getting into the specific details, which is why I'm wasting your time now, sorry. There are also two problems that are not stated in the episode about the use of flight as a legendary action. First, Vile Curse costs 3 legendary action points, which is all that the Demilich gets until the start of its next turn. So using an extra legendary action after you've used all of your legendary action points is a violation of the rules. In addition to this, the flight legendary action allows a Demilich to move up to half of its movement speed. The regular flight movement of a Demilich is 30 feet, so in actual fact, when the Demilich uses a legendary action to use flight, it can only move up to 15. The Demilich, which still looks like a lich, by the way, in the panel, is moving 30 feet into the air. And I'm calling it a Demilich because it's the Demilich's abilities to howl, use Vile Curse, and flight. That's the only monster it can be. To be fair, all of this is really silly. I mean, God forbid a Demilich, a pretty powerful monster, be able to move 30 feet as a legendary action. 15 feet just seems insulting, really. And there's not a great precedent for why this is the case either, other than the fact that other flight legendary actions, specifically I'm thinking about dragons, all allow the creature to move half of its movement speed. Although those actions also cost 2 and allow for the use of a wing beat kind of knockdown situation, which is, not exactly comparable, is it, to moving half of your 30-foot movement speed. But that's how the rules are, and so that's another missed opportunity for Matt Mercer to get another point, which he absolutely didn't need. He won this game by miles. And that's not to say that I'd have spotted that without having looked at the Demilich stat block again. But at this point, Matt Mercer is in a flow state. He correctly fires off that jump is not a skill. Nat 30 is not possible. You would not be able to sneak attack, because the Demilich has true sight. It doesn't matter if Una the rogue is invisible or not. It can still see her, and therefore she has no reason to have advantage on it. Unless she's a swashbuckler rogue, which again, we aren't told that, so it isn't relevant. He continues. Not only does the rogue not have Turn Undead as a capability, but it's an action, not a bonus action, and it's incapable of destroying the Lich because it's too high level. This string of statements is one of the more impressive ones in the entire video. Although, technically he does call it a Lich, which obviously the visual presentation is Lich, but by the mechanics of this creature, as we've discussed, it is a Demilich. So honestly, there's very little to pick Mercer up on here in this panel. The only thing I will note is that Una the rogue is asked to make a check to jump the requisite 30 feet to reach and stab the Demilich, which, while there is no jump check in D&D, does suggest that we're looking at one of the exceptions to the normal jumping rules, in which, quote, in some circumstances, your DM might allow you to make an athletics check, DC determined by DM, to allow you to jump higher than normal. But going by the normal rules, even with a 10-foot running start, you can jump vertically a number of feet equal to 3 plus your strength modifier, which usually caps out at 5. This maxes out at 8. This doesn't place our rogue anywhere near. But what if the rules were followed and the Demilich had flown instead 15 feet up into the air? Assuming a strength of 20, which is quite wild for a halfling rogue, even if we take on the rule that you can extend your arms by 1.5 times your body height to increase your relative jump height for grabbing ledges or potentially stabbing Demiliches, that's still just 9.5 feet of jump height, which is not close enough to be within 5 feet of the Demilich. I told you being pedantic was fun for me. So that's it. But for those of you that remember the original clip in quite some detail from Actually, you'll remember that Matt Mercer at the end was awarded 18 points by Mike Trapp, the show's host. Specifically, he was credited with 18 correct corrections. I awarded him 17.5, which is including my rather harsh critique of his reasoning earlier on in the video. Except I took that silver axe point away from him, right? It's a low-stakes conspiracy theory, but I firmly believe that Brennan Lee Mulligan, the question writer and fact-checker on set, corrected Matt Mercer at some point between Matt saying the incorrect correction and Mike Trapp reading out the "that's 18 correct corrections" by probably looking it up off screen. We don't see it in the final cut, but the amount of points awarded aligns with this version of events. Mercer wasn't awarded that point, in my view, because there's 18 correct corrections plus the silver axe comment. So for everyone who got in the comments and decided that the silver axe point definitely shouldn't have counted and they're really annoyed about that, well, I don't think it did. So how many things are actually wrong with that comic strip? Well, by my count, I think it's 23, which really worries me. Surely, if you're making a question like this, you'd try and make there be 20 or 25 things wrong, right? You'd try and make it a nice round even number unless you literally couldn't stuff any more incorrect things in. Especially if you have access to the internet while you're writing the question, surely you'd make it a nice round number. I'll tell you why I'm worried. Because I've just made a big long video by being a pedantic arse about a many years old clip featuring two of the internet's favourite dungeon masters right now, from one of my favourite creative projects in media right now as well. What if I've missed something too? please let me know in the comments. Whether I have or haven't made a mistake, this experience has been fun and genuinely valuable to me in deepening and broadening my knowledge of this game that I already know quite a bit about. And I can recommend this sort of exercise to you. One of the best ways to start building up your own knowledge and interrogating your own assumptions is to start being really pedantic about someone else's work or assumptions first. Not in public, usually. And I hope that anyone involved in the production isn't, annoyed or upset at what I've done here. I know for a fact that if I were on that production, I would have missed quite a few things, partly due to nerves and the requirements of brevity, and also not wanting to waste everyone's time on production, on cameras, on sound. I mean, it's a lot. Besides, I didn't start this whole video with actually, so actually I get no credit at all. Although actually, technically, this was originally a shiny question, and you don't need to say the famous phrase at the start of your answer if you're answering a shiny question, so there you go. But having launched that vast array of unfiltered pedantry straight at you, I just need to say thank you for watching. Genuinely. I hope you've enjoyed. In any case, with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the thegrungeonmaster. Thanks again so much, and I'll see you in the next video.